you know, the other frustrating thing is that I feel like in a way it's partly been a distraction because I came forward, to talk about what Cambridge Analytica does and my experience, and not, and also to take my share of responsibility and my share of blame for being the research director when Cambridge Analytica was being set up, and I feel like after we reached out to Facebook, and my thinking was, okay, we can work with Facebook, I can own up to this, and this company can face the scrutiny that it deserves, and people can be notified of what's happened. And the frustrating thing for me is that this story has really spiraled into Facebook's bizarre reaction to it, rather than what the original story was meant to be about. And that's not necessarily an entirely bad thing. I think Facebook deserves a certain level of scrutiny, but that wasn't what I set out to do. I'm not on a crusade against Facebook.
So, well, then let's move back to how. And I don't mind I hope you don't mind if I use the Sunday Mail's description of you.
Sure.
How did a Canadian gay vegan end up working for a military contractor in the UK?
Good question. Yeah,
but you worked on the Obama campaign, and by the way, Private Eye. I don't know if any Private Eyes here. There was a rather sort of dismissive and I think rather sexist remark about Carol's work. Said it was gushing. They also said you had nothing to do with the Obama campaign. You were a coffee boy. I remember the similar line said about Papadopoulos. I spoke to Ken Strasmer, who is somebody who started the micro-targeting for Obama, and
he was the national targeting director for the Obama campaign,
and that's
then for Bernie's campaign.
That's kind of your first. You're only 18. That's your initiation into the dark world of micro-targeting.
Yeah. So I haven't actually read much of the press. You guys probably know more about what's happening than me. I've sort of been all over the place, so I don't even know who's saying what. I think. One thing that I would say is I'm just a very curious person, and the thing that really was compelling when I joined SCL Group, this was before Cambridge Analytica, this was before Steve Bannon, this was before Facebook data, this was before everything. The experience that I had before when I was working in the coalition was really frustrating.
For the Lib Dems, by the way, in the coalition government.
Yeah, I'm not a Tory.
Yeah.
If you are, that's fair. Not against Tories. It was really frustrating working for a party where you kind of see lots of mistakes happening, and you're trying to warn them, and they don't really want to listen because it sounds too pessimistic. And you point to data, and you go, "Look, you guys, the foundation of your party is collapsing," and that's just considered overly pessimistic or not being a team player or whatever. So, because it was supposed to be the honeymoon period, so we were supposed to be all happy and nice, and I'm like, but everything's collapsing. Why, shouldn't it sort of felt like, when you're on the Titanic and the guy who sees the iceberg and goes, hey, can you steer the ship somewhere? And they go, you're just being pessimistic. It's an unsinkable ship. Yeah, this ship has never sunk before.
So what are the things you told me about that?
But just, sorry, to highlight, just because people have asked me this. So when I first met Alexander Nix and SCL Group, the thing that they offered me was the freedom to sort of explore a lot of the research that I really wanted to do for a long time. Before I joined SCL, I sent a proposal to the University of Cambridge to look at whether I could model personality using micro-targeting approaches, and whether we could predict political behavior using psychometric data. And I showed Alexander Nix this paper, and he's like, "Oh, this is brilliant! Oh, we could totally use this!" And so he's just like, "Yes, come, join, do your thing." At the beginning, I had a lot of freedom, that's what was really appealing to me at the beginning. Is that so
should we just explain about psychometrics, because this relates to what you're saying about the Lib Dems? So Chris has a brilliant riff on this, and I think some people might know about Ocean, which is these 5 psychometrics. You can explain in a moment, but you did explain this brilliant thing, because you're obviously interested in it before you joined SCL. On the Ocean score, it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And Chris will explain they're not like Myers-Briggs. These are verified through billions of points of data. They're not covariables, they're discrete things which can vary in themselves. I'm being non-technical here. And
that's okay. You should dive in. This is exactly what I'm saying.
But you said liberal Democrats scored high on openness and low on agreeableness. They're basically open, disagreeable people. The worst people to have in a coalition. They hated that sort of, let's get on with the Tories. Is that right? And so this is the underlying stuff.
The reason why I got interested in psychometrics in relation to politics was because one of the roles that I had when I was at the Lib Dems was research and data and technology and all that, and they kind of just plump it together. Even though they are different things, but anyway. So I was trying to sort of look for relationships between demographic variables, so things like income or gender or socioeconomic status or ethnicity, all those kinds of things. The things that you can kind of see on a person, right? When you're walking down the street, those are sort of demographic variables. And for Labour and Tories, there are demographic features that do distinctly relate to much more to Tories or much more to Labour. But one of the things that I found was that there were people who demographically looked like a Tory and demographically looked like a Labour voter, and they were all supporting in some way the Liberal Democrats. And so when you're modeling that, you go, okay, so I can't use these variables. There must be some kind of what you call latent construct, some other hidden thing that you're not seeing, because they're all having the same behavior, but what you're measuring isn't the thing that's explaining that behavior. And so I came across a bunch of papers on personality and political orientation, and one really stuck with me, which is the Mondak paper, which it had this brilliant model, which was just sort of like a diagram of like disposition moderated by the environment, and then you have political behavior with some like other sort of moderating features. And that made so much sense to me. And so I looked at personality traits, and I realized that although there weren't that distinct, although Liberal Democrats weren't super distinct demographically, psychographically they were. So they were much higher on openness than the typical supporter of other parties, but also lower in agreeableness. And the problem with some of the names of the traits is that it's socially desirable to call yourself agreeable, I'm, for example, not a very agreeable person. I'm quite stubborn, and so that would be a positive way of spinning low agreeableness. And then I started to think, right, this makes sense, because one of the things that we found in focus groups was that people would say, I'm Tory, I'm Labour, but when you had Lib Dems, they'd say, I vote Lib Dem. And it was and it's because the Lib Dems are new as a modern party, so not many people have grown up Labour or grown up Tory, and so they have to decide to become a Lib Dem. Almost every single Lib Dem has to decide to become a Lib Dem, and that personality profile being really open, but not that, but slightly disagreeable or stubborn makes sense, because you want to adopt ideas. And you're open to really new ideas, but you're also really bloody stubborn, and you're willing to remove yourself from a big party and go into the little party just so you can say, like, I'm right and you're wrong, and I know I'm right, and you're going to realize that you're wrong in 20 years, and I'm going to say I told you so. The classic example would be like a Richard Dawkins kind of character, somebody who likes to explore ideas but also is really stubborn.
So that drew you, all that research. At the time, Ocean, you said there was a research project that they were hoping, because of the data coming from social media, particularly as we know from Facebook and Kogan's work, people have been following that. that's a bit of a rabbit hole, that they could actually, this was a social science that could be tested. Like there was a whole belief in the academia, various universities going, if we can amalgamate all this data from social media, we can actually predict people's behaviors like a science. Is that right? That's what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, when I joined SCL, and they sort of gave me this freedom to explore some of my ideas, in part because the firm, like traditional information operations, which is sort of what the firm does. It's, at the time when I joined, 80% of its clientele were military. That is usually done in places historically where you don't have a well-developed communications infrastructure, so the techniques were pretty old school. And when you look at trends in a lot of developing countries like Africa, for example, you have places that are leapfrogging in a generation of technology. So they're going from very little broadcast media to mobile internet in sort of one giant leap. And so that meant that there's sort of an explosion of data happening all around the world, even in places that are developing economies. And that creates an opportunity if you're a contractor, whether it's for the military or for various political activities in developing places, to sort of modernize and update your I/O techniques.
I/O
information operations.
And you just explained briefly about this fifth battle space, so people understand.
Oh yeah.
This came from a military background and not a civilian background.
Yeah. So information operations. So in military doctrine, you've got something called the five-dimensional battle space. So you've got land, sea, air, space, like Star Wars space, and then information. So information is often called the fifth plane of your battle space. And so information operations is usually sort of divided into psychological operations and then like cyber operations.
And social.
And civic, what the military calls like civic affairs, which is sort of like funding think tanks and stuff to produce policies or whatever. I don't really know. And so the idea of this fifth dimensional battle space is that if you can gain informational dominance against the belligerent, against your opponent, you can change their perception of this battle space, of this information battle space, or indeed of the physical plane of your battle space, and then exploit weaknesses or vulnerabilities from mistakes that you're sort of catalyzing. Because one of the things that people often ask, I've noticed, is sort of, well, what's the difference between information operations or I/O and just marketing? Isn't this just good marketing? And if you think, when does a general use a marketing or branding approach to convince the opponent on the other side of the battlefield to do something, right? You can't, it's like, imagine you're a general, right? Like, let's say, I'm America and you guys are ISIS, or vice versa, I don't know, and I can't create a tourism campaign for this hill that I want you to go on, sponsored by the American government, right? Because that's just not credible. So I have to make my opponent think that there's something there that they need to go and do. Whether it's like we have a bunch of inflatable tanks, right? And surveillance planes see that and then they go and try to attack and there's nothing there and you flank them, right? Or if you know that the general that you're fighting, often phones up people in their hometown for advice. You need to proliferate that hometown's newspapers with information that is false, right? It's about changing the perception of your target so that they start to make mistakes and you can then exploit that. And the idea of digitizing, but that is really resource intensive, right? That's like, we've got a general and we're trying to change, they're a key decision maker, so we're going to try to change their decision making. But the advantage of sort of the digital space is that I can take all of this information and as much about you as, 10, 20 years ago studying this general, because you put all your information in one place. And then also, because so much of your communications channels and your information channels are all online, you can then exploit that. And so you can create a programmatic approach to do the same kind of thing that, 20, 30, 40 years ago you'd focus on this general. You can do it for like the entire nation.
So this is an important moment to stop and consider that people are saying that what Cambridge Analytica did, and Robert Peston quoted that great data guru, Richard Littlejohn, today, saying, yeah, but what Cambridge Analytica did was just like what Obama did. You're saying it's not like traditional campaign. Yeah, that's bullshit. Thank you. And and we'll get, because everybody wants to hear about Bannon and Mercer. Bannon also started Breitbart at the same time, Cambridge Analytica. It's directing them to fake, not campaigns or ads, to fake realities. They're creating, and you think Cambridge SCL did this and Cambridge Analytica did that. It wasn't saying, follow this campaign, it was saying, this is your new reality.
Yeah. When I was there, the one of the sort of bread and butter things of the company is, and it promoted this in, its pitch decks and its brochures and all kinds of things, is rumor campaigns. Rumor campaigns, undermining people's confidence in civic institutions so that they, don't trust the results, or starting, rumors about an opponent, or as Alexander Nix said in The Undercover, getting in prostitutes and creating compromat with that. It's about changing people's perception of what's actually happening, and we call it fake news. It's just a new name for it. It used to be called like a rumor campaign or disinformation. And the reality is that everyone in the West is shocked by this, but really this is just blowback, because like our governments do this all the time in Africa. Our governments do this all the time in South America. Our governments do this all the time in Asia. We do this to other people. But it's called fake news because it's happening to us, but really it's disinformation, and fundamentally.
He also said in the Undercover film, I hope you've all seen it, that I think we dip deeper in the well of fear. And I noticed Carol pointed out last night that Kogan's, this is the guy who was doing the search project on Ocean, which a lot of the data came from and ended up.
Yeah.
Is he Dr. Spector anymore? Is that, yeah, no.
I don't know, he changed his name to Dr. Spector, and then now he's Kogan. I don't know.
But he's looking at the Dark Triad.
Yeah, Dark Triad.
Dark Triad. Do you look at Dark Triads? Was that one?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the Dark Triad. So like in the 5-factor model of personality, these are 5 traits that, because when you think about what is personality, in psychology they call it the human universal, because these are the core constellation of attributes that exist cross-culturally. Everybody in the world has a personality. So it doesn't matter if you're born in China or you're born in Texas, like you have a personality. That might be culturally moderated. Your behavior might be socially scripted because you've grown up in a particular way and follow a certain social code. But these 5 traits exist cross-culturally, cross-linguistically. And the difference between the 5-factor model and something like Myers-Briggs is that the research that has validated it came bottom up. It wasn't some guy going, this is my version of personality and that's what it is, and let's sell it like Myers-Briggs. It was based on sort of this bottom-up research.
And the Dark Triad is a kind of a bad combination of those 5
But the
traits.
Dark Triad is sort of these like other 3. So that's Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, and so you've got in the population a normal distribution for each of these 5 traits. You don't have a normal distribution for these 3 other traits, which is sort of why they're like this like other thing. But you have enough people with them that it's argued that they're considered personality traits. They're just sort of like this sort of other set of personality traits that a smaller group of people have.
And so let's get to Bannon and Mercer. So you worked for SCL like 4 or 5 months or whatever before the pitch came. There's a long story about how it came about, but you asked to meet this guy called Steve, and there's a very funny story. I think other people have heard it. Why it's called Cambridge Analytica, apart from the fact that Alexander Nix didn't get into Cambridge. By the way, he's just been suspended from, so we should be slightly respectful, from Cambridge Analytica. But why is it called Cambridge Analytica? And there's an information operation behind this, isn't there?
Yeah. So it's funny that you say that Alexander Nix. Yeah, he went to Eton, but he didn't get into Cambridge, and that sort of speaks a lot to his inner demons.
His dark triad.
Anyway, so I got introduced to Steve. Alexander introduced me to Steve because he had been talking back and forth during my first couple of months. Alexander was talking to Steve Bannon. This is like before Steve Bannon was Steve Bannon, right? This is like some guy with like a blog that was for angry white dudes, right? Like, I mean, that's what Breitbart is. Like, I got introduced to Steve, and part of the reason was because Alexander's sort of typical razzle-dazzle wasn't really that convincing to Steve. Like, you have to remember, when you're dealing with a lot of clients from sort of the post-colonial era in the Commonwealth, you can kind of sell this sort of posh English Etonian old sort of colonial, there's sort of a weird power dynamic that you get. And so he would often sort of play that up with a lot of African clients or Caribbean clients. But it didn't work with Steve, it sort of went over his head. And Steve would be coming, and he'd be more interested in going and talking to like student groups at Cambridge, right? And I think that speaks a lot to who Steve is, that he would come over here, and one of the main things he wanted to do is go to Cambridge and speak to student societies, and rather than have dinner with Alexander Nix. And so he introduced me to Steve, and we talked a lot
about fashion.
Yeah, because one of the things. So I was also started. I haven't finished, and probably never will have time to finish PhD in trend forecasting and fashion, because for me, politics and fashion are like the same thing, because they're all about identity and your role in society, and trends in fashion are an interesting proxy for culture, so Steve and I were talking about what is culture, and how do you change culture. I said that if you want to change culture, you first have to understand this construct that is culture. You can't change something if it's just a sort of amorphous blob that it's there, but you can't really define it. So I said define it, quantify it, because if you can quantify it, then you can measure it, and you can actually start to create a roadmap of how to change it, if that's what your objective is. And so I said that if you think about the adjectives that we use to describe personality traits, loud or quiet or neurotic or whatever, and then you also think about some of the words that we use to describe culture, they're often the same. So if you think about like the stereotype of an Italian being more extroverted or maybe slightly neurotic, or no offense if anyone's Italian, it's a great country, I shouldn't slag off cultures whilst I'm talking. If you think about, what is a British person, or what is a German person, or what is it, immediately the adjectives that you're thinking are the same adjectives that we use to describe people. And so I said that arguably the units of culture are people. And I know that kind of sounds like obvious, but, if you can then measure or predict the sort of dispositional attributes, or the constellation of attributes that make up a person, you can measure that person, and if you can measure that person, you can measure people. If you're measuring people, then you can extend that to, measuring a culture, right? So, and one of the things that I said is, like, it sounds like what you want to do is start a trend, and so you need to find, if you think of the distribution of certain traits that make up people in your population that influence culture, right? What you're actually doing in terms of culture change is you're picking a particular trait and you're trying to move the distribution one way or the other, right? And if you can predict those attributes in people, then you can create literally a list of people who make up the bit of culture that you want to shift, if that makes sense.
But you use a very brilliant example that one of the reasons Bannon, quite early on, you make clear that, I'm talking to you, that Cambridge Analytica was set for the presidential election, but that Steve liked British culture because it had a attributional value in America and was very influential.
Yeah. So I forgot to actually answer your previous question, so I'll answer it. So anyway, sorry, I kind of go on tangents. I've had a long day. But anyway, so the conversations that I had with Steve were interesting, and I think Alexander noticed that that he liked sort of talking about ideas and theory and all of that, which I love to do. And so he decided that in order to impress Steve Bannon, we needed to set up a fake office in Cambridge. Because we needed to because the thing is, his Etonian razzle dazzle, look like welcome to our office in Mayfair, and I went to Eton, and here's my posh business card. It's from the same printer as Prince Charles. Isn't that amazing? And that didn't really work. So we needed to present ourselves as much more academic. Not to say that we weren't academic, but we needed to curate our presentation, and so we created this fake office in Cambridge and brought a bunch of people to set up this office beside the university to make it look like this is our Cambridge site. This is our Potemkin Cambridge office, and so later when the Mercers bought in and Steve and then they appointed Steve to set up the company, he decided that he should call it Cambridge Analytica to sort of, as a tip of the hat to our deep links with the University of Cambridge. A false reality was infused into the name Cambridge Analytica. It's its soul.
And the Mercers, let's explain Robert Mercer. Do many people know who Robert Mercer is? Probably do by now. Robert started IBM Natural Language Processing, the same analytical, how to human behavior or human meaning, how to boil it down. And then Rentec, Renaissance Technologies, hyperfast trading, one of the successful funds. You met you met Mercer. What was your impression? Was he like Steve Bannon or slightly different?
No, he's very different. I've worked on a lot of political projects, and usually the not always, but usually the rich guy that's funding it is not always the smartest person in the room, and so you have to kind of go, thanks for your money, let me try to explain in human terms what we're actually doing with it. But the difference was that with Robert Mercer, he has a PhD in computational linguistics, so he gets it, right? He's smart, and so he's actually the smartest guy in the room, and he'll make you know that. So he'll ask those questions that you're I was really hoping you wouldn't ask that. But he's totally different. Whereas Steve is very sort of he's much more extroverted and much more brash, I think, and militant and aggressive in how he talks. Robert Mercer is just totally silent. He doesn't really talk much, and he'll sit and not really look at you and just not say anything for 20 minutes and then just have one cutting remark that slashes the entire thing of what he was saying because he finds that one weakness but he was really smart, and it was sort of this perfect storm of the sort of militant vision of Steve Bannon and the fact that there was a billionaire who already knew what algorithms were, so you didn't have to explain machine learning to him because he became a billionaire because of machine learning, because of algorithms. And so you had a billionaire who just said, right, okay, what is your training set? What is, you know, what are your stats? What kind of methods are you using? And it was this perfect storm of having a really rich guy who was super smart and super technical, and a guy with a really, you know, militant vision of what he wanted to do, who was pushing this billionaire to put in lots of money. And then you had Alexander Nix, who is the razzle-dazzle Etonian who was there for the rides, going to the fancy dinners.
And they gave you, I've seen estimates vary from $15 to $20 million a pound. They gave you a lot of money to set up this thing.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on how you count the money. The principal investment was $10 million at the beginning, but Mercer also, so the way the company was set up, because everyone finds it confusing as to like, what is Cambridge Analytica and like, what is its relationship with SCL? So let me explain it so that people get it.
Fine.
So the Mercers were concerned about the idea of acquiring like a military contractor to work in a foreign military contractor to work in American politics, because the optics of that would probably be suboptimal. So they wanted to create like an American brand, you know, not just optically, but also like compliance with FEC regulations and like FARA and all of these things that the United States has. So they set up Cambridge Analytica, and the way it worked is that SCL Elections, which is one of the companies in SCL Group, and the reason it was with SCL Elections is because Alexander had more shares in that, and he wanted to keep more of the control for himself. So he decided to use SCL Elections. And SCL Elections then assigned all of its intellectual property to Cambridge Analytica, and then Cambridge Analytica licensed back the intellectual property to SCL Elections, and then created an exclusive service provision contract between Cambridge Analytica and SCL Elections, so that all of the work that Cambridge Analytica would get would have to go to SCL Elections. So Cambridge Analytica is more of like a concept.
Fake office, a fake company.
It's everything happens out of the London office of SCL. It's not actually technically Cambridge Analytica. Most of the staff there are paid by SCL. It's not Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica is there for compliance reasons and branding reasons, but behind the company is the same military contractor, SCL.
And so how much did they give you, do you think, in the end, with all these various contracts? It's more like 20 million, is it?
Yeah, yeah, because the other thing that Mercer wanted, which was quite smart, you have to remember also that, like, when you're a billionaire, you need to find, like, a challenge that is, like, worthy of your resources. So, you know, because it's quite boring to be a billionaire once you, like, can just buy everything, right? So a lot of these really rich guys want a challenge, and so, like, the nation becomes the challenge, right? And so he had all, like, and the other thing about these like billionaires in the States is they all have these like little rivalries. So he really didn't like the Kochs because the Kochs were like too influential. So he wanted, and they would go around and like buy up these random companies that, you know, had like 5 people, but they were like an important political consultancy or something. And so you'd have these like massively rich people going and buying these tiny little like mom and pop shops just to like expand their network within like local Republican politics in Iowa. And so he came up with this idea, which actually was quite smart, where, you know, if you put in money into a political consultancy because you own it, it's not a donation, right? It's an investment. So you don't have to report that, right? And then you go and donate to a bunch of different candidates, and you earmark that funding to your firm, right? So you put in $1 million here, and that $1 million then has to go back to the company that you own, and you can take that money out, and then you can put it somewhere else, and you can recycle that money so that you gain the same kind of political capital, but you amplify the effect of every dollar that you're spending. And it, you know, in terms of the actual sort of cost of projects, it doesn't really matter because you can just put in as much money as you want into the company, because you're the owner, you're the investor. It's not a political donation. So you can report these smaller donations, but really you can fund as much as you want in the actual service provision without necessarily having to report it.
This is important because, I mean, from what was reported yesterday, and I think you told me before, it's quite clear that though Donald Trump wasn't known to you as the candidate, I'll talk about it, you can get some water. The research you did, Drain the Swamp, or others did, Drain the Swamp, you'll have to talk about Mauer im Kopf, if I've got that right.
That's German for
war in the head, we'll get to that. And also Deep State, and also the vote is rigged. You talked about that being a classic SCL operation. Trump pulled that out. You didn't know that you knew this was a sort of presidential election from the get-go, from 2013. You didn't know it was Trump.
No. And I don't think necessarily anybody at the company per se. I can't really speak for Bannon, but most people wouldn't. Remember like when Trump was funny, right? Like when he was like Apprentice Trump, like you're fired, right? Like this was before, you have to remember like the world was different back then. But
the means that he used,
so like we went out and explored the population we tried to be as neutral as possible. So one of the advantages of having non-Americans run research about Americans is that we would look at the United States in the same way that we would look at researching an African country. So one of the things that people kind of forget is like we will use words to describe other cultures, like that's a ritual, right? But here it's a tradition, right? So and that sort of bias can sometimes cloud what you see or what you're actually observing, and you start to discount things that actually might be important. And so we went around and with a how should I put it, with a radically open mind to the population, we went and explored all kinds of constructs and ideas, and one of the things that we found was that there were like all kinds of bizarre things that were happening in pockets of America that no one was really talking about, but we were observing because we would bother to ask the question. One of the advantages, one of the things that we did that compared to like traditional targeting or traditional political research is we would just go and ask people what we should be asking. I think that was one of the big problems, for example, with the Hillary campaign, is it's like, if you can have an amazing data science team, you can have amazing models, but if you haven't asked the right question, you're modeling the wrong thing, and so the insight that you get is systematically biased from the starting bias that you have. So we would go and sort of have this like really open mind to things, and we would listen to what sounded like crazy people talk. But if you start hearing that more and more, and you kind of go, okay, maybe there's something to that. And after listening, just in a totally unstructured way, like we would just go and like chat with people. We would go sit in their living rooms. We'd look at like how they lived, like what was their life like, and then we would start to develop, a hypothesis, here and a hypothesis there, and that's when we would then go and test it in a quantitative fashion.
Just unpack that a bit again. You test that like online with like hundreds or thousands of people. So a phrase like "drain the swamp" or something like that.
Yeah. So I'm just getting to that. So one of the things that started to emerge was that we literally heard these sort of narratives about Washington as something that was like gross and disgusting, that was dirty, right? And we literally tested this phrase because it kept coming up. It was literally like the words of people. They were saying it's like we should drain that swamp. Like it wasn't creative genius in the sense that we just listened to people.
And then you tested it. Did it resonate? It wasn't just random. Oh, I like that phrase. You go back and test that.
Yeah, we tested it. But some of the other things that we were testing, we weren't just testing like words or sort of verbal narratives, we were also testing visuals, and so we tested a lot of images of walls, for example.
Explain
or
about
people scaling a wall.
Explain about Mauer and Kopf and that German research, because it's an amazing bit of research. Was this from you, by the way? Are you to blame for this? Mauer and Kopf.
Well, I'm not to blame for German perceptions and
you introduced research.
Yeah, right. So, okay, so Mauer and Kopf is this effect in post-reunification Germany where people will overestimate the distance east to west compared to north to south. And this idea of having a wall in the head is that, the wall sort of physically embodied the separation, the cultural separation, the ideological separation, and it not only like physically separated people, but it psychologically distanced and made, East Germans the other for West Germans, and West Germans the other for East Germans. And so even when the wall came down, that psychological distance still remained. And one of the things that I find interesting about this narrative of the wall is that when you go back and start to think about culture change and creating an enduring and lasting effect, that building the wall is not actually to stop immigrants. Empirically, most of them, undocumented immigrants actually fly on a plane, so like a wall's not actually going to do anything. But it's not to stop immigrants, it's to embody separation. That's what it's for. And if you can embody that separation, and you can further distance in the minds of an American, us here in America and them elsewhere, even if it's just across a river or just across a desert, then you have won that culture war. Because if people, one of the things that Bannon is really keen on is this idea of walling off America so that it can rediscover its purpose. He's sort of obsessed with this. Like, America needs to become America again. It needs to find its purpose. And in his eyes, the only way that you can do that is like wall it in, shut it off, and then you can then play around with it until it's fixed in his eyes.
And that wall, therefore, doesn't have to be real. You just build it in people's heads.
It's a concept. It doesn't have to be built. As long as people think there's a wall and then start to distance themselves from other places, or even if they build it and another administration takes it down, if it's already distanced, other countries in people's minds, that will be enduring.
So, which brings us to another slightly darker thing you told me, which does relate back to gay Canadian vegan,
right,
and about closeting and about racism closeting, and just I'll observe as a point, Bannon was brilliant. I mean, the people he recruited in the UK, Milo, Rahim Kassan, and yourself, really. I'm sorry, I'm not putting you in the same category. He was very good at using kind of exclusion and identity politics. But you had this very interesting moment. You said when you discussed, was it you or your researchers, racism in the South, you understood what they were talking about.
Yeah, so one of the things one of the things you have to, when you're researching people, is that you have to be really open to first hearing their perspective. So even if it's really uncomfortable, you have to sit in a dispassionate way and listen to what they're saying, right? And be really careful not to condemn, you have to create, sorry for using this term, you have to create a safe space for anyone that you're talking to. And one of the things that we found was that people who held, who deeply held really robust sort of like intergroup biases, like racial preferences and what you could call racist views, they would talk about how frustrating it is that they can't be their real self, right? You would have young white men who were very conservative, very sort of traditional in their views, also being really frustrated that they can't in their eyes, be a real man anymore when they go to a pub or whatever, and that they would literally talk about how they felt victimized by feminism or by multiculturalism, and it was really interesting to me because they were using narratives of the closet, and that they were going into the closet, and how frustrating it is to be a closet a closet misogynist, a closet racist. But you laugh, but you have to take a step back and go, right, so in order for me to understand this person, I have to put myself in their shoes. That is not to justify those views. That is not to sympathize with those views. But you have to have an element of dispassionate empathy to go, so this is what you genuinely feel, and this is how you genuinely perceive something. Despite the fact that you are a white American male in the South, and actually in many respects are very privileged, you see yourself as a victim. And for me, or for a gay person, like the narrative of the closet is a very familiar thing, and that feeling that they have is bizarrely relatable.
What had they been closet homophobes?
Sorry?
If they'd been closet homophobes and said to you or your searchers, actually, I wish I could say how much.
Yeah, no, we had that all the time.
Did that? Well, I suppose what I'm getting to you is, and we can all see Chris's brilliance and your empathy.
Yeah.
Where did the dark moment come? When did it get to? I mean, got to have questions at some point. So
okay. Sorry, I ramble on a lot.
No, everybody loves it. We can go on all night. We can take a break and come back, and we'll be back on Monday. Was there a point where all this brilliant objectivity and understanding of data and in the way of people got dark? I mean, why did you leave? I've never quite got to the bottom of why you left.
It was a progressive sort of. I think, when we first got all the Mercer money, it was just really interesting because we had all this money, we could study whatever we wanted, and that was quite compelling for people, everybody.
You were 23 by this point, 24.
Yeah, 23 or 24, and that was quite compelling. But the more that we started getting our research and priorities focused on things that started to become much in my view, darker, and starting to meet a lot of the clients that Mercer was introducing to us who wanted to then use this research. Sitting in a room with, very right-wing evangelical Christians talking about how can we, win the war against, the gay agenda, and, little do they know, everyone in that room is, the lavender persuasion. And so, and also the actual environment of the company, I became quite toxic. Alexander Nix was a really hard person to work for, because he is the most pleasant person when you first meet. He's very charming, but as soon as he feels like he owns you, he really does feel like he owns you. And if you disagree with him, if you present any sort of if you challenge him on anything, he will lash out. And the amount of bullying that happened in that office was really became quite difficult to deal with. In addition to the fact that we were working for some pretty psycho candidates.
What happened to your predecessor?
Oh, you mean Dan?
Yeah.
Well, he's dead. So I didn't know this at the time when I first joined, but my predecessor, he was working in Kenya for Uhuru Kenyatta, who's the president of Kenya, and he was just found dead in his hotel room, so that's why they had the vacancy.
They didn't tell you that when they recruited you?
No, they didn't tell me that.
A vacancy due to murder in Kenya?
Well, I don't want to say murder. I can't say he was murdered.
Oh, no, just he was found dead.
He was found.
I get that.
dead in his hotel room.
So you left in 2015. As long we will get some questions now, and obviously, hopefully, you'll be back on Monday with some more revelations and more detail moving on forward. So 2015 you left. You worked for the Trudeau campaign. You worked for I think you go back to work on the Trudeau campaign. Did you, as the Private Eye has published today, I'm not scooping you here, they say something they said on Facebook, we won about Brexit. How did you feel about when the Brexit vote happened? I mean, it might be different to how you feel now when it first happened, and Trump's election. Did you feel responsible? Did you feel happy? What did you feel has happened since 2016?
So, sorry, I'm confused by your question.
So the Private Eye have said somebody on Facebook, sorry, I should have warned you this before, it's just come out, said, we have a Facebook thing of Chris saying, great, we won when Brexit happened. How did you feel when Brexit actually happened? And then obviously, 4 months later, in November 2016, Trump. Did you feel responsible? Did you feel sick at heart?
So one of the things, so I'm actually a Eurosceptic, believe it or not. But I wouldn't call myself a Brexiteer in the sense of what you have to understand, like, coming from another country living in Britain, I will never be European. So I look at Europe very dispassionately in the sense of it's not an identity that I will ever have. And for me, just to answer your question about apparently this Facebook post, I wouldn't know, I don't have Facebook, so. For me, the European Union really does have a very substantial democratic deficit, and as a liberal, how many people here can name their MEP? Right? Like, okay, right, great.
And also, it's more difficult for Canadian.
In research, you call this an extraneous sample.
Oh.
So,
putting that aside, I know sort of.
Well, let me answer it because apparently So I knew a lot of people who worked on the Leave campaign, I think that I don't necessarily think that the European Union is the be all and end all, particularly when you look at its relationships with creating trade barriers for farmers in Africa, and
makes it more difficult for Canadians to get into the UK. So the next question is, because the Brexit thing we'll maybe talk about more later, the Trump thing. Did something turn then? You go, oh my God, it's gone wrong. Is that part, or did you don't realise Cambridge Analytica's role by that point? Did something? How do you feel the night Trump got in?
Well, with Trump, watching the campaign sort of unfold, and starting to hear, like, my ears perked up when I started hearing some of these things, like Drain the Swamp, or Build the Wall, or, the Deep State, because these were all these were all narratives that had come out, from the research that we were doing. And then when Steve Bannon sort of emerged as, his advisor, I kind of started going, okay, and then when all of these narratives about Russian interference, and targeting voters on Facebook started emerging, and I started thinking back to, okay, well, we created a massive Facebook data set. We were working with a Russian professor who was going back and forth working on social profiling programs that were publicly funded in Russia, and we were like interfacing with Lukoil, a very large Russian oil company.
What did you do data research on? What was it, an oil company you researched on?
Well, so I heard that Lukoil's official line was that they were wanting to run some kind of contest in Turkey, and apparently that's why we're talking. I don't know. They have some weird line on that. I didn't quite understand what they're anyway. But I don't know. Like they wanted to know about our data assets and what kinds of capacity we had in terms of our algorithms and how we could influence people. And Alexander Nix sent a white paper that I wrote to a bunch of senior executives at the company, and even sent an email to me saying that he's sending it to the CEO of Lukoil, which, by the way, has a pretty open relationship with the Russian FSB, which is their intelligence service. And I started thinking back, and I kind of went, well, I don't know if this company knowingly colluded, but so that's not what I'm saying. But there was definitely a risk there because we created a very large data set of Facebook users using a professor who was going back and forth to Russia as we were talking to a bunch of Russian companies.
I think we'll take some questions now for about 20 minutes and then take a break. There are certain areas we'll have to exclude as questions just because there's a mic travelling around, and hopefully you'll be back on Monday, Chris, remember to talk some more things. This is a big subject. So I think this lady there with the pink, green, questions, not non-statements.
No, in your opinion, how much did the dark arts affect the result of the Brexit referendum?
So we take 3 questions, the dark arts question, and then this gentleman here, just here.
Can you comment on a little company called U-Campaign? Are you related at all?
U-Campaign, dark arts, and this lady here.
Knowing what you know now about everything that's happened, if you could go back in time and change anything, what would you change?
These are brilliant questions, thank you. So let's start with the first one, which was the dark arts. I mean, the question was, Brexit. Was the dark arts used in Brexit loosely, whatever that means?
Well, I'll be clear, I didn't actually work on the Brexit campaign, so I can't comment on that.
Can't comment on Brexit at the moment. And then U-Campaign.
I don't know. I haven't. Okay.
So I think U-Campaign was an app that was used later on in the Trump campaign. On the right. It's run by an evangelist who runs this U-Campaign. But I thought this is the easy question to answer. If you could go back in time, what would you change?
I'd take the boring job in management consultancy.
Okay, 3 more questions. So we just in the middle there. Where's the other mic?
Yeah.
Should we take something? That gentleman just in front of you there.
Thanks. Hi, Chris. What do you make of Cambridge Analytica today saying that they deleted the data as soon as they knew that it was been obtained wrongly? They also said they didn't use it in any campaigns and didn't do any personality testing.
Okay. Give me part 3 at a time. So I can't quite see who's hand. That lady next to you. Yeah.
I was very interested in your comment about Lukoil. Do you think that the Russian government perhaps has any of the data set that you were describing earlier, or do you think that they just got a certain bit of information? I mean, to what extent does the Russian government potentially have some of this 50 million, the data from the 50 million Facebook users?
Actually, we'll take those 2 together because I think they're kind of related. The first one is about deleting the data, they still have the data, and then a further question, do the Russians have the data sets? But do the data and the algorithms, you can lose the data and keep the algorithms, couldn't you? I mean, you can make a model, you can wash out the data, but you still base the model on 50 million data.
You need data. An algorithm works on data, so you need data in order for an algorithm to spit out imputations or derivatives or whatever. I think what you mean is if you alter the data in some way, whether it's through dimensionality reduction or some kind of imputed derivative, you can keep that, and you don't necessarily need the raw data.
Because like Carol, I'm an idiot. Yeah. Could you not make a sort of machine learning bot, an algorithm, out of one set of data, 50 million Facebooks, and then it starts running, and then you get rid of that data. You can bury that data and try out new data, which you bought legitimately.
Theoretically you could do that. I think it's important to understand that an algorithm is, if you think about it, kind of like a set of rules, almost. Not all people tech bros are going to attack me because not all algorithms are rule based. But it's easy to think about the most simple thing like a decision tree, if this then that, right? You still need the answer to the if this, you still need that. So but you can merge, you can manipulate, you can alter, you can amalgamate data in all kinds of ways so that that data doesn't necessarily look like the original form of the data.
So that's my question, almost forensic. Even if you could find the algorithms, even if they've hidden the data, you could work out from the algorithm itself the original data it worked on, and then you could work out if they had built it out of that sort of data.
So a data set is sort of, think about it this way. I can say something in English and I can say something in French, and they look fundamental. Or let's make it even more different. Like I can say something in English and say something in Chinese, or write it in English and write it in Chinese, and the information contained is the same, but the execution of that information looks very different, and it follows different rules and orders and all of that, but it still conveys the same information. So that's what I mean in terms of.
Does that relate to the Russian thing? Do you think that the Russians had, or at least Kogan gave over to the IRA was very effective, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg was very effective targeting, that they could be working on that same or similar data sets?
Well, what I do, I mean, obviously I wasn't inside Russia, so I can't say whether or not they have the Cambridge Analytica data sets. But what I do know is that we made it pretty damn clear to a lot of people in Russia that we had this giant data set, and that it was all sort of prepackaged with predictions about what's going to influence people and their political orientation, and that can like plug right into like online display networks and advertising networks, and that data was being modeled by somebody who was also working in Russia on Russian projects that were very similar, and actually talking about some of the projects that we were working on whilst he was in Russia, as we're interfacing with a company that has connections with the FSB, very well-known connections with the FSB. And when you look at the security that, at least at the time when I was there, the security of that data was subpar. I mean, people would just email around data sets. Like it was pretty bad.
Let's have three from over.
I can't remember. I don't think I answered your question. Sorry, can you say it again? Or wait, it was did they delete the data?
Yeah, they're saying they deleted the data as soon as they found out that it was wrong. They haven't used it during that sounds like so far. Obviously all these things you said did do.
Well, what I'm saying is that this is the foundation of the company. They spent $1 million on this, and to say like. My question would be, when we looked at other data sets, when we looked at, for example, consumer data sets, one of the things that this company says is, oh, we just have a lot of consumer data. Well, consumer data doesn't produce a signal for these constructs. Like, it doesn't work. You can't use consumer data to predict personality, because knowing if you, for example, shop at Walmart or not, that might be informative to, socio-demographic attributes, or, income, or some kind of, or even just proximity to a Walmart, but it doesn't tell me fundamentally about who you are, because that's a utilitarian choice. It's not necessarily something like Facebook, where you're curating who you are, your music, what you watch, what you like, funny things that you click on, and those are things that you can't get in the consumer data sets that they say that they use to do their profiling. When we did, when we ran pilots to try to predict some of these attributes using consumer data, we found that I think it was like the highest correlation was like 0.2, which is just, I mean, that's nothing. And so I am
correlation like in a sort of 3,000 data points from Facebook on that line.
I'll say this: it's not the number of features. It's the signal that you get from. There's a lot of noise still in Facebook. That's why you do something called dimensionality reduction, where you sort of cut out a lot of the random bullshit, and you get down to the stuff that actually produces signal.
Compared to marketing, you said 0.2 for general marketing information. What would the correlation be like on Facebook?
I mean, it depends on the trait and the like. I mean, because when
Give me a number.
I'm going to be slagged off on if I give you like a hard number, and like I would have to caveat it.
But it's much more predictive.
Yeah. I mean, we would have correlations that were above 0.4, 0.5 on some things, which is at least in sort of human behavior that is fairly high, because a physicist